Hello and welcome to Politics here on France 24. This was François Hollande's first presidential press conference. It lasted nearly 2 hours and a half. This Tuesday, it started with a 45-minute speech and then questions and answer with some 400 journalists. A much-needed explanation as François Hollande has broken one record. Under the Fifth Republic, he is the most unpopular president after 6 months in office. So could this press conference and the explanation he delivered to the French and to the press be the beginning of his comeback, or will he continue his slide? To talk about this issue with me here today is Mark Dean, who is with Bloomberg News, and also on the set, Philippe Moreau-Chevrolet, who is a communication expert and a columnist, and last but not least, Denis de Montpion, senior reporter with the Nouvel Observateur. So François Hollande had promised during the campaign that he would hold a press conference every 6 months and that it would take place in a neutral place. He did fulfill the 6-month promise. However, all the journalists were asked to come to the presidential palace, the Élysée, to hear and interact with the president. Here are the highlights.
6 months into the job, François Hollande defended his record in front of more than 400 journalists. For his first major press conference, he chose the Élysée Palace, not a neutral place as promised during his campaign. The man who once called himself a normal president changed his political message.
Today, I'm a responsible president, a fully responsible president. That means I'm responsible for everything, but I don't decide everything.
With approval ratings at a record low, Hollande dismissed criticism and argued that reform took time.
Elections change leaders, but not the reality. So I understand why the French are worried about the crisis. But the only question in my eyes, the only one, is not the state of the opinion today. It's the state France will be in 5 years' time.
Tax hikes, competitiveness, Europe. Hollande explained at length the decisions he made in the last 6 months and denied any policy U-turns.
For the last 6 months, I've made my choices, and I've stuck to them without making any deviations, because those choices fit my commitments and my principles, and most importantly, fit the interests of France.
Hollande called on the French to unite in the face of a major economic crisis and stated fighting unemployment was a priority. But it's unclear whether these announcements will quiet his critics.
That's the question, Mark Dean. Will this quiet the critics and help him because he felt that he needed to do some explaining before the French?
Well, there's always going to be critics, but I think that Hollande has got them on the back foot with this press conference. As we were just saying a minute ago, it's not going to change the poll ratings immediately, but Hollande gave a credible performance yesterday. He showed an understanding that really what matters, the poll that matters is in 4.5 years from now. And he really did take his presidency forward a step, I think. We weren't talking here about the subjects that dominated this were economics, by the way, and we weren't talking about the reduction of the retirement age for people who started working early, the raising of the minimum wage, or the 75% tax. We're talking about things going forward, things that are controversial, but very much in a 5-year perspective for putting France back on the rails. I think that Hollande was convincing in that sense, if a bit long. And, we talk about the voters, but the sense I get is that, speaking to the bond markets and to France's international partners, it probably would have gone over well as well.
Right, because obviously he was also talking to the market and wanted to show that although he's a socialist, he can also handle issues like debt and deficits and be tough.
It's very important. Voters don't watch a 2.5-hour press conference most of the time, but there's a whole range of people who are paid in London and New York to do so, and it has been a reasonably positive response from them, as it has been from the French press this morning.
Do you share the assessment that it was a good performance?
Absolutely, he did well. He did well for François Hollande. I mean, he was coming a long way. He's very unpopular for the moment. As you said, he's the most unpopular French president after 6 months in office. even more unpopular than Jacques Chirac in 1995, who was really unpopular. So he has a long way to go, and maybe we will see the press coming from the Hollande bashing to the Hollande loving after that press conference. Maybe that's what we saw this morning in the press, and maybe that's the beginning of a kind of a new contract between him and the French people. Even though I don't think that the polls will change dramatically after that performance. That's only the beginning of it. That's a beginning of a long, long process for him. But he did well. He performed well.
Do you agree, Denis de Montpierre?
Yeah, it's true. He appeared as a very calm president, very clear in his explanation, and he, contrary with what we saw before with Sarkozy, was very hectic. You know, when we remember his press conference, you saw Hollande very, still, very precise, not nervous at all. Playing on word with the journalists who ask questions, and no panic whatsoever. And since we know that France was on the brink of disaster 6 months ago, I mean that doesn't mean that the economy is recovery that quickly, but at least you have the feeling that there's someone who is trying to change the things and without panic.
But he also tried to shed this image of quote unquote the normal president. He repeated, I am responsible. I am a responsible president, because there was this notion that maybe he didn't really want to take charge and say, as a US president used to say, the buck stops with me. Do you think he did that?
He clearly appeared as a man in charge of the country. He even said, he was not, taking care of the poor that are very negative for him just now. He says, my purpose is to get France out of the, situation in 5 years' time. So, in a word, he gave, an appointment to French people in 5 years' time, or even before, because he reckons that in 2 years' time things will be clearer, better, and he said as well that unemployment was his priority. And although he mentioned that we would have a year still of unemployed people, but then with the decision he has taken up to now, that things might clear up in the end.
The question is, okay, the presentation was good, then the content. I mean, that's really also the issue. Martine, people have been talking about, the right wing has been critical, saying it's not enough, it's not well calibered. Do you think he was still vague? Because he says, okay, look, we need to cut 60 billion in 5 years, but he doesn't say where and how.
Well, of course he was vague. I mean, no government... I mean, he's vague on purpose, but also just because that's the reality of things. No government, no head of state, no head of government can tell you what they're going to cut to save 10 billion euros or 12 billion euros in 2015. It's just not
Especially
possible.
if you're a socialist and you're not supposed to cut.
Saying that he wants to do it, I think, was sending the right signal fundamentally on the economy and to people who are concerned about that. And I think that broadly speaking, he showed a good technical understanding of the issues, which is important. There will always be people who say that more should be done. They may be right, but oftentimes it's a matter of at least going in the right direction.
But people on the left must be surprised, if not angry, by what they heard from President Hollande. He basically told them, I'm not your president anymore, I'm the president of all the French. So that's why...
That's what he said. That's what he said at one point in the conference, absolutely.
Absolutely, but he also illustrated this by saying, I will raise VAT, despite having promised he would never do so.
That's true.
He's talking about decreasing the cost of labor, which was a taboo during the
campaign. And also
cutting
some jobs in the public sector, which is also another taboo.
So the socialists must be...
Yeah, and the unions this morning and all the left-wing parties are quite angry at him. He had to do it at this point because he needs to get some more confidence from the private sector, and especially from the private sector talking heads, and such as Laurence Parisot at the MEDEF, or even people like Bernard Arnault, who went quite vocal against him. He has to.
LVMH
he needs to buy some time, as you said. All his communication policy from the beginning has been to buy himself some time. He needs to have some more time. He needs now to buy some time from these people, from the private sector, from the banks, from the companies. And so he goes to them and a little further from the left side. And it's an austerity U-turn. He doesn't want to acknowledge that, but it is actually an austerity U-turn. That's the reality of it.
Do you agree with that? I mean, there were even some surprising things when at some point he kind of talked to the rich and he said, we know we're taking lots of taxes, but we value you, we hope you understand, basically. And so that's maybe surprising from a socialist.
Yeah, but as a matter of fact, when you listen to what he said, you see a man, a president who has always been very clear, because during the campaign he has always been realistic. He was criticized by many people saying, we don't know what he wants to do, how he will do it, and now that he's in the job and he's doing things, it's true that he has he took some measure that the left the far left anyway didn't appreciate very much. Nevertheless, he appears as the man who really wants to get France out of the crisis and that situation. He mentioned the fact that with Mrs. Merkel, from Germany, they were in disagreement, but nevertheless, what they wanted to do is, try to get Europe united in order to help Europe and countries like Greece to get out from the terrible situation as well.
I think that's right. I mean, Hollande shows himself as being very clear in his mind and very precise about what needs to be done, and that is part of his strength in this situation. I think that it shows him. Talk about shedding the question of the Président Normal. I think that it's that may be deliberate, maybe not. But the point is, he looked very natural in the role of president in a way that we haven't been used to seeing him really up until now, and that's really what matters from a communications point of view.
Right. He's a technician. He's like an elected Mario Monti. Mario Monti was not elected. Hollande has been elected, but he's still a technician. He's not very charismatic, but for the first time, you could believe that he was president. Publicly, he was quite good. He was confident. He could tell what he would do, not very precisely what he would do, but at least a little bit, and you could follow him and believe him.
And then he knows where he wants to go.
It's not very precise. You don't have a broad vision.
He acts in cold blood, and besides, he's like a duck. We know that he supported rain, when he was elected, and
he's always afloat. Hollande is always afloat.
But he's like whatever happens, the polls are a disaster. But he's not impatient, not nervous at all.
But that's something you can do at the beginning of the presidency. In 2014, there will be elections, and this will be another thing altogether.
But he knows
he has very limited
time. It's now
time,
that he has to act, in order to.
But there was also this notion that his team, the government, was not very professional, that they were not up to the task. That's why they bungled some things. Some ministers are saying one thing, others are saying... I mean, was there also a need to reassure the French that, professionals are in charge and not just amateurs?
I don't know. I mean, I think that's a little bit sort of our media bubble. People don't. It's natural that 6 months into a presidency, when unemployment is at a 13-year high, and the economy isn't growing, that there's going to be criticisms.
And we had the same thing with Sarkozy's ministers at the time. So in 2007, it was also difficult for them. Yeah.
True. No, up to a point, you wonder whether it's not, a strategy, a political strategy. I mean, you have a minister who mentioned, depenalization of the drugs, and then another one, speaks of gay marriage. And
I don't know if clumsiness is a strategy. I don't know.
I don't know. But, economically, they do the job.
Issues like the 35-hour work week, when the Prime Minister Jean-Marc Ayrault said, well, we might discuss it, it's difficult to imagine that it's just clumsy. I mean, it might be a way to prepare the opinion to some change.
The Prime Minister wasn't that clear, in fact. He just said, he was open to discussion. That didn't mean at all, he was ready to...
But the way they handle the communication, I wouldn't bet on the strategy thing. I would more go to... I think they are clumsy and they don't really know what they do all the time. But maybe some of it is issued from the strategy. Maybe some of it.
Right. And also, just quickly, on the European level, do you think François Hollande also is in a better position now that he's explained himself, especially on the issue of boosting France's competitiveness?
Well, look, I mean, there's the European level, and certain people in Europe love François Hollande, and certain people don't, and we know who those people are. You know, I mean, I think that Hollande, you know, has a bad image in Germany, you know, and I think that matters. But it is back to this question of buying time there too. You know, it's also true that no economy, and including Germany, cannot, you know, turn itself around overnight. It takes time, and it takes sort of calm financial waters to do it. But you know, Hollande does need to keep a minimum of German support on board, and probably this press conference helped that. But I think that he's probably got skeptics across the Rhine, partly because he's been taking on Germany directly, but also partly because, you know, the Germans don't understand, you know, very different political economic context that France lives in.
You agree quickly?
Yeah, he looks pretty much as a professional from that point of view, you know, and he knows as well that Angela Merkel needs, you know, she will go to election next year, and he knows perfectly well, you know, they can't have a clash together, you know.
Do you agree that?
I agree with that. Yeah.
I mean, you could almost argue the other way, that a clash, you know, could play very well in France and in certain quarters. You know, France, Hollande standing up to the Germans.
Issue is a tough issue for Hollande anyway.
Against Europe, then.
Yeah.
And none of them have any interest to go to a clash, for sure.
Okay, well, thank you very much to all of you. We'll see if François Hollande bounces back at least a little bit in the polls. It shouldn't be.
If we will go to Hollande loving, that would be great.
From Hollande bashing to Hollande loving, we'll see if we go to that extent. Thank you very much to all of you, and thank you for watching this edition of Politics here on France 24.